this is the latest, most extreme form of the pivot to Moscow that has characterized Trump's rhetoric and behavior in the last couple of weeks. And it really does feel like an irreversible pivot.
Okay, David Lubin, Senior Research Fellow for Chatham House's Global Economy and Finance Programme. Welcome back to The World in 10. Let's start with Ukraine, shall we? We know now that Donald Trump has suspended military aid to Ukraine, who have responded by saying they're going to be ramping up weapons production. I wonder what position Ukraine is in to, I guess, support daily life, really, if they are diverting yet more resources into war, as it were.
Well, I think Ukrainian daily life, although it goes on to some extent as normal, I think the basic point is that Ukrainian daily life for the last 3 years has been characterized by being at war with a very large neighbor. And of course, the announcement by Donald Trump seriously intensifies the problems that the Ukrainian government is facing, both with respect to what it takes to prosecute a war against a very large neighbor, and also with respect to maintaining daily life as you describe it. Of course, this is the latest, most extreme form of the pivot to Moscow that has characterized Trump's rhetoric and behavior in the last couple of weeks. And it really does feel like an irreversible pivot, since it kind of, I think, reflects a number of different strands of Donald Trump's thinking. The first is geopolitical, and I think I've talked with you in the past about the idea that Trump has of ununiting Russia from China. And I think from a geopolitical point of view, that really does remain the prime motivation for Trump's behavior. And Marco Rubio, in an interview a few days ago, reinforced that message that at a kind of geopolitical level, the administration's aim is to kind of prize Russia away from China, on the grounds that, why should you try and confront two large powers at the same time? But I think there's something else going on, which is partly a kind of ideological affinity. The US right and large chunks of the European right see in Vladimir Putin a leader that expresses a set of values that is close to theirs. Sort of reasserting the value of the patriarchy, ending support for liberal projects like transgender rights and LGBTQ and diversity, equity and inclusion. These are all, this kind of set of values brings Putin and the Western right very close together. And then overlaying all of that, certainly within the Republican Party, there's a kind of tribal element that I think is worth considering, which is the sense in which that, if you say the word Ukraine to a certain type of Republican in the United States, the word association, the word association word that comes to their mind immediately is Biden. That somehow Ukraine was a kind of a project of the Biden family, a country that Hunter Biden, the ex-president's son, made money out of, and therefore it needs, it behoves the Republican Party in the United States to put distance between itself and Ukraine, purely, as I say, in this sort of kind of tribal level. So you've got a kind of geopolitical thing going on, which is this sort of reverse Nixon. You've got an ideological thing going on, which is the sense in which the American and the European right feel comfortable with Putin more than they do with Zelensky. And you've got this kind of tribal thing emanating from the Republican Party in the United States, which causes them to shiver when they hear the word Ukraine. It kind of gives them a sort of guttural response.
And of course, if you're sort of sat in the Kremlin as Vladimir Putin today, you are going to be looking to take advantage of this sort of surprise development as quickly as you possibly can, aren't you? Does he have the economic situation to be able to sort of ramp up his own war effort, again, whilst trying to keep on side those, particularly in the major cities of sort of St. Petersburg and Moscow?
Well, in a way, Putin doesn't need to do very much because, the behavior of the Trump administration in the last 2 weeks must be making Putin feel quite confident that any settlement in Ukraine will be one that is extremely favorable to the Russian government, particularly because, the central ask of Volodymyr Zelensky is to back up a ceasefire with a security guarantee. Since the United States has absolutely rejected delivering that security guarantee, the cards are very much in Putin's hands. And so, in a way, he doesn't have to devote additional resources to the war effort because he's got the US president arguing his case. And so I think, the whatever strains the war effort were putting on the Russian economy, which are, something we talked about earlier in the year, and, those strains, particularly by requiring the Russian central bank to raise interest rates to extraordinarily high levels to help contain inflation. The fact that monetary policy had become so tight in Russia was, it seemed, at the end of last year, at the beginning of this year, beginning to cause internal friction within the Russian elites. I suspect that friction will be much softer now. That Putin can count on support from Washington in achieving whatever near-term settlement he wants to in Ukraine.
Is Russia, is Europe, I should say, in a position to squeeze Russia any further? Because they are sort of scrambling to find, any sort of way of helping Ukraine at this moment.
Yes, well, the ultimate form of support would be for Europe to beef up its defense spending and be able to kind of provide a credible security guarantee by itself. I think that this is maybe stretching my expertise a bit. I'm sorry, but I think, there are two problems. The first is the time it would take for European defense spending to create an environment where Europe could credibly supply Ukraine with a security guarantee. And secondly, although for many years people have argued that Europe responds well to a crisis, the most famous being, in 2012 during the Eurozone crisis, Mario Draghi was able to kind of pull everybody together by acting very decisively in his capacity as the president of the European Central Bank. That argument that Europe responds well to a crisis, that argument seems a bit weaker now to me, because you have a bunch of governments within the European Union, Hungary, Slovakia, most obviously, but also plenty of others, who also have sympathy with Vladimir Putin. And so you not only have the relative inability on the part of the EU at the moment to provide a credible security guarantee, but thinking about the EU as a whole, you may not have a full set of, you may not have a high degree of willingness, which is why, despite Prime Minister Keir Starmer's efforts in the last couple of days to kind of, shore up this coalition of the willing, the number of countries willing seems to be relatively small.
That being said, we have had the European Commission chief, haven't we, Ursula von der Leyen, talking today about 800 billion euros to be spent on defence as part of a rearmament drive. You talked about the time there. How difficult is it for all of the European Union, which to the outside world looks pretty rich, to gather that sort of money together?
It takes, I think, a very open debate about the fundamental choices that European electorates need to make between guns and butter. We've seen in the UK, for example, very decisive move on the part of the Prime Minister to fund an increase in defence spending by reducing the aid budget. Some of the repercussions of that decision have already been apparent. The resignation of the Development Secretary, Annalisa Dodds. And I suspect that there may be more kind of political kind of blowback that follows from that. And I imagine that you'll get a similar kind of debate across Europe. Increasing defense spending there may be lots of people who support the idea of increasing defense spending, but at a time when public debt levels are already very high, and where the claims on public resources coming from, education and healthcare and all the rest of it are very loud, the competition that those claims on public resources will have with an increase in defense spending means that the debate over how big that increase in defense spending should be and how it should be funded are likely to be slow and loud.
Now, in your first answer, you talked about, again, this sort of disuniting that Donald Trump is hoping to do between Russia and China. Today, we've had the confirmation and the start, indeed, of tariffs being placed on Canada and Mexico at 25%, and then this extra 10% on China. Let's start with the Chinese. Does that in some way play into this disunification that you spoke about, if there is such a word?
It's actually even less grammatical than that. Donald Trump's actual word was ununite, so it should be ununification. Anyway, the tariffs. I mean, obviously, the tariffs are very aggressive, and the tariff on China specifically. He announced an original 10% and now an additional 10%. Which are those two 10%, in other words, the 20% to be levied on China, is contained within the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, the sort of basis on which the tariffs against Canadian and Mexican imports are also being leveled. Remember, this is all about, these three countries, Mexico, Canada, and China, being insufficiently supportive of US's effort to contain inflows of immigrants and fentanyl. Having said that, the effective, before Trump increased by 20% the tariff against imports coming from China, the US tariff against Chinese imports was already close to 20%. So we're now, the effective tariff that the United States will be imposing on goods coming in from China is pretty close to 40%, 39-40%. So it really is a very punitive tariff. And of course, we're now waiting to see how the extent to which Trump follows through on all the other tariff and economic sanctions initiative. On March the 12th, we're going to see a 25% tariff on imports into the United States of steel and aluminium. The Trump administration has announced investigations with respect to the dumping of copper and lumber into the United States. Trump has talked about imposing a 25% tariff on imports coming from the European Union. He's talked about imposing tariffs on cars, on pharmaceuticals, on semiconductors. He's talked about imposing reciprocal tariffs against any country that has a tariff rate higher than the United States. There's a lot of stuff to come. A lot of the news is likely to wait until after the 1st of April, because the 1st of April is the date on which a bunch of trade investigations by the US Department of Treasury, by the Trade Representative's Office, by the Office of Management and Budget, and by the Department of Commerce. All of those investigations are due on Trump's desk by the 1st of April. And I imagine it won't be long after that that we begin to see a lot more activity around tariffs. Bearing in mind that Trump is a self-declared fan of tariffs, and he really believes that the income generated by tariffs can go a long way to finance the tax cuts that are the kind of centerpiece of Trump's domestic economic policy. And on that issue, you may disagree with the economics of it, but the revenues that the US is capable of generating through tariffs may well be very, very substantial. I mean, if you look, for example, at the tariffs that are going to affect against China, Canada, and Mexico, US imports from those three countries last year approached $1.5 trillion. So if you get 25% from imports from Canada and Mexico, albeit that there's a 10% tariff on imports of energy from Canada, and 20% from imports from China, without going into, issues to do with the elasticity of these imports with respect to the tariff. In other words, without going into the extent to which US imports from these countries might fall as a result of the tariffs. By itself, Trump, the US administration can gain something like $300 billion of tariff revenue from imports from these three countries. So the tariff revenue argument is quite a serious one and remains very attractive to the Trump administration. The budget negotiations that are taking place in Congress at the moment, I mean, I'm really dramatically oversimplifying the numbers, but the proposal, roughly speaking, at the moment, is for tax cuts to be extended. The cost of extending those tax cuts will be about $4 trillion over 10 years. At the same time, Congress has been talking about spending cuts of around $2 trillion over 10 years, around just below half of which comes from cutting spending on Medicaid, on health support for low-income families. But that leaves a gap of, more or less $2 trillion over 10 years. If you're getting $300 billion, again, there's a very bold number that doesn't take into account any changes in the level of imports that might result from the imposition of tariffs. But if you're getting something like $300 billion just from these countries a year, you can see how, from the administration's point of view, tariff income quite credibly might fill the gap that exists now between the cost of the tax cuts and any spending cuts that affect the domestic economy in the United States.
Is it not, though, naive to make the one assumption that you sort of, the caveat that you put in there, that the numbers are not just going to reduce? Because you said it, they're prohibitive, these tariffs. They're so costly. Surely it impacts the numbers.
It will. We don't know by how much it will impact the numbers, partly because one of the things that might help offset the pain that these tariffs inflict on US consumers and US businesses that pay the tariff is the probability that the dollar strengthens, or rather the currencies of US trading partners weaken in a way that helps to offset the effect of the tariffs on their exports to the United States. So, the fact that foreign currency, the fact that the Canadian dollar, the Mexican peso, the Chinese renminbi might become much cheaper for US consumers to buy goods from, helps to, well, A, offset the more unpleasant consequences of the tariffs, and B, makes the analysis of the tariffs right now quite complex, because we just don't know by how much the Chinese renminbi, for example, will depreciate over the course of the next year or so. Just on that, I mean, it's interesting that at the end of last year, the Chinese central bank, in its monetary policy statement for the fourth quarter, removed language from its statement that had gone into previous statements, and the language referred to the ability of the foreign exchange market in China to kind of price the dollar itself. In other words, to allow fluctuations in the price of the dollar as market participants, constantly form different views about where it's going. What the Chinese central bank seems to be after now is much greater, more direct control over the exchange rate. And I think what the Chinese central bank has been saying since December is, saying to the market, guys, back off. We're facing very serious geopolitical moment now, and therefore we, the central bank, not you, the market, we need to be fully in control of Chinese exchange rate policy, because we might need it as a tool to help the Chinese economy respond to the kind of pressure that will be under in a hostile Trump administration.
Just finally, I want to investigate what I would imagine, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, Donald Trump would see as a victory for what was initially a threat of tariffs, which was one he made against Taiwan, because he's announced this $100 billion investment by Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, which is Taiwan's largest firm. He said he threatened the tariffs, didn't he, saying that they had stolen American chip manufacturing. I mean, is that really the kind of outcome that he would have been looking for, or would he have preferred them to go, do you know what, we're not prepared to give you $100 billion, stick your tariffs on? And actually, does that benefit him even more greatly?
Yeah, I mean, in this conversation, we've talked about all the different purposes for which tariffs are a policy tool. One is to help reduce the trade deficit, whether you believe that or not. That's what Trump is after. One is to generate revenues. One is to use tariffs as a kind of tool of coercion. You know, the most obvious example that we've seen since Trump was reelected was the sort of spat between him and the Colombian president over the return of illegal migrants to Bogota. But the story with Taiwan kind of reflects the fourth, I guess, purpose that the Trump administration has in mind for the tariffs, which is to kind of catalyze a capital inflow into the United States to revitalize US manufacturing. And so, in a way, the threat to TSMC is a kind of way of kind of imposing some kind of burden on TSMC to accelerate or expand its plans for opening up factories in Arizona and other places in the United States.